The myth of the submachine gun. The newsreels showing Germans armed to the teeth with submachine guns were nothing more than Goebbels' editing tricks. In 1941, the Wehrmacht entered the USSR, technically stuck in World War I. Behind the facade of panzer divisions hid millions of infantrymen carrying antique rifles. It was a systemic fraud that cost Germany its army. The 1940 divisional roster reveals the scale of the disaster. For every 12,609 rifles, there were only 312 submachine guns. That is one automatic weapon for every 40 men. German strategy ignored the reality of infantry skirmishes. The Reich command made a fatal error by investing in expensive optics and single-shot precision. In the forests and villages of Russia, where the outcome depended on lead density, the high-tech Wehrmacht proved toothless. While headquarters drew arrows on maps, the common soldier frantically jerked a bolt-action handle, turning into a static target. The blitzkrieg relied on the speed of armor, but once the tempo dropped, it became clear. German infantry was technically castrated and unprepared for a war of attrition. The Mauser trap early battles proved that vaunted German precision was useless against a curtain of fire. The primary drag on the army was the Mauser 98K, a tool Hitler considered an ideal, but which in reality turned the shooter into a relic-aged victim. 5 rounds and a manual bolt against automatic weapons was not tradition. It was a death sentence. The Mauser 98K is called a masterpiece, but under the fire of a PPSH, it became an iron leash. While Berlin polished the steel, soldiers paid for every click of the mechanism with seconds they didn't have. In 1935, the Wehrmacht made the Mauser 98K the standard, effectively freezing 19th century technology. A range of 1.5 kilometers was impressive only on paper. In reality, manual reloading yielded a pathetic 15 rounds per minute. In modern combat, the German marksman was forced to hit with the very first bullet. The enemy gave no second chances. A production run of 15 million units is not a sign of triumph, but proof that Reich industry could create nothing better. It was a hunter's tool, useless in a mass slaughter where rate of fire decided everything. The Mauser forced soldiers to fight in an old-fashioned way, exactly where they needed to be, flooding the zone with lead. The G41, engineering masochism. The obsession with precision failed upon meeting Soviet infantry. Officers demanded rate of fire, and the answer was the G41 rifle. But the attempt to catch up with the USSR produced the most temperamental piece of garbage in the history of the Reich. Engineers went to absurd lengths to make it fire, creating a weapon soldiers hated more than the enemy. When German HQ saw the Soviet SVT semi-automatics, they panicked. Their response was supposed to be a triumph, but it turned into the most humiliating failure of German designers. The G41 was so finicky that soldiers preferred to go into battle with captured trophies rather than trust their lives to this over-engineered hunk of iron. The problem with the G41 lay in an absurd military requirement. The barrel could not be drilled for gas tapping. Designers at Walter and Mauser were forced to invent a bizarre muzzle cone system that instantly clogged with carbon and dirt. The rifle weighed nearly 5 kilograms, almost as much as a light machine gun, yet jammed after every second magazine. It was so unbalanced and unreliable that frontline troops called it a tool for masochists. Instead of mass rearmament, the Reich got an expensive, useless device with a measly production run of a few 100,000. It was a prime example of how the German passion for complexity and foolish dogmas killed their own army faster than enemy bullets. The Schmeisser Lee. The failure of the G41 forced Berlin to admit they were hopelessly behind in the semi-auto race. While engineers frantically redrew blueprints, another symbol took center stage, the famous MP40. But did you know its greatest secret is hidden in its very name? We are exposing the lies sold as historical fact for decades. Millions of people repeat a falsehood, calling the Wehrmacht's primary submachine gun by the name of a man who didn't design it. The real MP40 was a triumph of hidden genius and brutal austerity, not the exquisite invention of a legendary designer. The name Schmeisser appeared because of a stamp on the magazine, but Hugo Schmeisser was only responsible for the feeding mechanism. The true father of the MP40 was Heinrich Vollmer. He created not a weapon for the elite, but a cheap stamped piece of sheet metal that could be churned out in any factory. It had no noble wood or complex milling, just steel and cheap plastic, bakelite. Its futuristic look was dictated by necessity, a folding stock to squeeze the soldier into the cramped hatch of a tank, or APC. The MP-40 was not the best submachine gun. It was a mass-produced product designed to save Reich resources. Despite its cinematic image, it was never the primary infantry weapon, remaining a tool for special units and vehicle crews. Pistol bullets in a rifle war. The myth of MP-40 superiority crumbled as soon as combat moved to open distances. It turned out the Nazi Wonder Machine turned a soldier into a target in an open field. Being in an open area with an MP-40 in 1941 was a death warrant. The German submachine gunner was king in a narrow alley, but in a Russian field he became an unarmed victim, unable to even reach his opponent with fire. The technical castration of the German infantry was in the cartridge. The MP-40 fired a 9mm pistol round. Its real effective limit was 100 meters, after which the bullet lost all stopping power and accuracy. At the same time, a Soviet soldier with a Mosin rifle or an SVT-40 could calmly pick off Germans from a distance of 400 meters and beyond. The German soldier could see the enemy, but his wonder weapon merely spat lead into the dust, falling short of its mark. This ballistic chasm meant entire Wehrmacht units were pinned down by lone riflemen. In a panic, German high command realized their infantry was catastrophically lacking a middle ground solution, something more powerful than a pistol, but more compact than a rifle. This helplessness was so glaring that engineers were forced to commit a professional crime. To save the army from extermination at medium ranges, they created something fundamentally new. But Hitler personally banned its development. Discover how the designers deceived the Führer to smuggle the forbidden fruit to the troops, the world's first assault rifle. Deceiving the Führer said no, but the designers said yes. The story of the legendary STG-44 began with a daring deception. To bypass Hitler's direct ban, engineers disguised the development as ordinary submachine guns. It wasn't just a new weapon, it was an act of desperation, created in secret to give the infantry a chance to survive the firestorm of the Eastern Front. The STG-44 was a technical explosion that ended the era of the carbine forever. Hugo Schmeisser created the intermediate cartridge. It was more powerful than a pistol round, but lighter than a rifle round. Now, a single soldier with a Sturmgewehr could land precise hits at 800 meters and then immediately flood trenches with automatic fire. This was the firepower sovereignty they had only dreamed of. However, behind the genius lay a grim reality. The Reich's industry, exhausted by war, couldn't handle the complexity of the design. The receiver, made of thin stampings, would bend, and a lack of alloy steel made the mechanisms brittle. Despite being revolutionary, the STG-44 was an expensive toy for a dying empire, appearing too late to change the finale. A fragile legend. A rifle that looked perfect on paper turned out to be an extremely clumsy tool in reality. Elite SS units quickly discovered that their wonder gun possessed fatal flaws that turned the shooter into a perfect target. You might be surprised, but a single butt stroke in hand-to-hand combat could leave a German with a pile of useless scrap in his hands. Let's look at why this legend was so difficult to use in actual mud. Every shot from this rifle turned the soldier into a living target. The STG-44 was a breakthrough, but its design flaws worked for the enemy better than any intelligence service. The SS elite received a weapon that gave away their position in a second and stripped them of protection at the most critical moment of battle. The main problem with the Sturmgewehr was muzzle flash. When firing, a massive plume of flame erupted from the barrel, literally illuminating the shooter at dusk. But the ergonomics were even worse. Due to the oversized magazine and the high sight line, soldiers had to keep their heads dangerously high while prone, exposing themselves to bullets. Add to this a monstrous weight of 5.2 kilograms, a full kilogram more than the old Mauser. On forced marches, the STG-44 became an unbearable burden. The final nail in the coffin was the fragile wooden stock. It would snap from the slightest impact in close quarters, turning the high-tech rifle into a useless piece of metal. The weapon of the future proved too delicate for the meat grinder of World War II. German blood in the AK-47. Despite its flaws, the design of the STG-44 sparks debate to this day. The silhouette is far too familiar to anyone who has ever held a Kalashnikov. We will gut these two legends to find out how much German blood and Hugo Schmeisser's blueprints are actually inside the Soviet AK-47. Copy or coincidence? For decades, historians have argued whether Kalashnikov stole the design from Schmeisser or if it was a parallel leap of thought. We'll look under the steel shroud of both legends to find parts that are identical with frightening precision. It's time to find out who truly defined the look of the modern assault rifle. The external resemblance between the STG-44 and the AK-47 is striking, but the devil is in the mechanics. Hugo Schmeisser did indeed work in Ijevsk after the war, and it is foolish to deny his influence on the production culture. However, the innards are different. The German uses a tilting bolt, while the Soviet model uses a rotating bolt. But the real secret lies elsewhere. Kalashnikov took Schmeisser's concept, the intermediate cartridge and mass stamping, which the Germans never quite perfected. The AK became what the Sturmgewehr was supposed to be, a foolproof tool that fears neither mud nor being used as a club. While the Germans built temperamental masterpieces, the USSR created a technology that conquered the world, using a German foundation to build an absolutely indestructible machine. Hitler's buzzsaw. While designers argued over rifle layouts, a true instrument of the devil appeared on the front. Its sound induced a trance, and its rate of fire turned a human body into dust in fractions of a second. Next, we'll break down the history of the MG-42, the machine gun the Germans assembled like a tin can, but which became the Allies' worst nightmare. The sound of ripping linoleum, this machine gun didn't fire, it tore through space. The MG-42 became the most effective way to turn a person into dust in a second. But few know that its phenomenal rate of fire was not a technical achievement, but an act of desperation. German engineers created a monster that devoured Reich resources faster than enemy divisions. The MG-42 spat out an insane 1,500 rounds per minute. This was death mathematics. The Germans knew they were outnumbered and tried to replace soldier quantity with fire density, but there was a staggering price to pay. The barrel would glow red hot after just 150 rounds, and the crew was forced to change it every few seconds under fire. The machine gun became a logistical black hole. While the Soviet Maxim could pour fire for hours thanks to water cooling, the MG-42 required an endless supply of spare barrels and ammunition that Reich factories could no longer keep up with. It was the peak of German madness, creating the perfect killing machine for which the army simply had no fuel or ammo left. But even this lead-eater had one detail that every army in the world still copies, including modern NATO forces. It turns out the Germans were the first to realize how to turn an elite weapon into a cheap tin can while maintaining its murderous power. Let's find out why this steel monster still lives in the world's armies, even 80 years after Hitler's collapse. The war ended, but German barrels continue to kill. While the rest of the Reich's iron rots in museums, the MG-42 didn't just survive, it became the gold standard for modern armies. We can find its traces in the hottest flashpoints of the 21st century, from the Bundeswehr to the Syrian deserts. This weapon proved to be more durable than the very ideology that spawned it. The secret to the longevity of Hitler's buzzsaw lies in its revolutionary stamping technology. The Germans were the first to prove that a lethal tool didn't have to be milled from a single block of steel, wasting thousands of man-hours. It could literally be baked from cheap steel sheets, like a tin can. After 1945, the Allies, who had previously dismissed German ideas with disdain, began mass copying this approach. Today's German MG3 is a direct descendant of the monster from '42, chambered for NATO rounds. Even the Americans, when creating their M60, didn't hesitate to lift the design of the belt feed mechanism from their fallen enemy. The MG-42 proved so perfect in its simplicity and brutality that the world still hasn't invented anything radically better for suppressing infantry. The fatal flaw of perfection. But why, despite having such advanced technology, did the Reich still end up on the scrap heap of history? The answer isn't in the blueprints, it's in the very logic of the German military-industrial complex. We have reached the finale, where we uncover the main cause of the collapse, why the best iron in the world lost to an ordinary guy with a trench shovel and a cheap rifle. The Germans had the best engineers and cutting-edge designs, yet their army ended in ruins. It's time to admit, the Reich's technological miracle was its own grave. We are exposing the systemic error of the German defense industry, which proved that when your rifle costs as much as a car, you've already lost to the guy with a cheap submachine gun. The primary reason for the Wehrmacht's collapse was over-engineering. The German passion for perfection turned weapon production into jewelry work where a conveyor belt was needed. While the USSR stamped out millions of PPSH submachine guns that worked in any mud, the Germans wasted scarce resources on precision-fitting parts and expensive optics. Their weapons were built for an ideal war on clean European fields, but they quickly faltered in the Russian frosts and the dust of the steppes. Technological advantage turned into a logistical nightmare. Repair shops were overwhelmed by dozens of modifications with non-interchangeable parts. Ultimately, the German defense industry became a victim of its own intellect. They created individual masterpieces that simply dissolved against the mass of cheap, reliable, and mass-produced Allied weapons. Conclusion: aesthetics over efficiency. The Blitzkrieg burned out in the flames of its own ambitions, leaving behind only mountains of high-tech scrap. We have seen the truth behind the propaganda facade. Technology without common sense is a path to catastrophe. But the history of tank duels hides even more secrets. In the next series, we will open the archives on how Soviet aces turned invulnerable tigers into smoking iron. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The era of the Reich's unbeatable weapons ended not in triumph, but in piles of rusty metal on the roads from Moscow to Berlin. The glossy myth of technical superiority shattered against a harsh reality. Wars are won not by elite prototypes, but by mass-produced, reliable iron. The history of Wehrmacht small arms is a vivid lesson in how engineering genius can become a hostage to political madness. The Germans created the world's first assault rifle and the fastest machine gun, but they never managed to give their soldiers a reliable tool capable of working in the filth of real combat. While designers in Berlin chased perfect blueprints, time was lost. In the end, the high-tech Wehrmacht met its end, holding either temperamental novelties or 19th-century antiques. It was the collapse of a system that prioritized aesthetics and complexity over efficiency. We've seen that behind every legend of a wonder weapon lay systemic miscalculations and logistical chaos that ultimately buried the Third Reich. The truth about the weapons is just the tip of the iceberg. If the Reich's infantry was technically castrated, what was actually happening inside their invincible panzer divisions? In the next episode, we'll break down why German Tigers were often more dangerous to their own crews than to the enemy, and how Soviet steel broke the back of the German beast. Don't forget to check your subscription. Hard facts only ahead.